Hello everybody. This is going to be our second day of chapter 1. We're going to break it into two different lectures. So we had one already, and then this will be our second one that kind of focuses on chapter 1. And most of the information that I present today is going to be from your book, although some of it won't be, and I'll let you know when I'll be talking about things that are not necessarily in your book. And other than that, I think that we can just really dive in. I hope that I solved the audio issues now. I got a microphone, nice microphone, so it plugs into USB instead of the other one, so I think that I won't dip in and out anymore. And hopefully the audio quality is just really nice. Ooh. Let us begin. Oh. Okay, so this is, just more introduction to the course, so kind of big picture sort of thing. So last lecture we talked a lot about kind of going through the history of a lot of the world, especially the Western world, mostly in religious and political figures who put restrictions on sexuality or said sexuality should be expressed X, Y, and Z way sort of thing. So that's what we focused on last time. And we'll dive in to a little bit more of that today. So we'll get more into gender roles and sex for procreation in the American United States context. So we'll talk about that today. But we're going to talk in terms of how today we're going to talk about a lot of how different cultures, other than just Western Europe and the U.S., what their attitudes towards sexuality are. So hopefully that will give us a deeper understanding of what a lot of people, or most people, kind of believed about sexuality, and I think that's very relevant to the psychology of sexuality. So we'll get into that. Your book has this nice little prologue before it all starts, so really we could have started here at the very beginning of the semester. But it's okay to insert it right now. So the 13th World Congress of Sexology got together and came up with these sexual rights. So you can see here the picture, do what you want, and of course that's basically do what you want as long as it's not harming anyone and it's consensual and things like that. So we've seen that by and large society, so political and religious figures, people in power, often put a lot of restrictions on sexuality. And so this 13th World Congress of Sexology is like, no, what we want in our culture now is much more freedom to express ourselves how we want to in terms of our sexuality, gender, and things like that, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone. So that's sexual freedom that I'm talking about. Freedom to have sex with who you want with, regardless of their gender, and whether married, unmarried, things like that. Sexual autonomy, so the right to own your own body and be able to say what you're going to do with it, what you're not going to do with it, And yeah, so we talked about, when we talked about especially that of slavery, this would be obviously the opposite of that, everyone owning their own body. And I think this is obviously not very controversial sort of right. Right to sexual privacy. So throughout time, maybe people, governments, and other figures could be a little invasive about people's sexuality. So what your orientation might be, and things like that. So this is a right to be able to be private about your own sexuality. And this goes forth for the class too. You have the right to your own sexual privacy, what your experiences are, orientation, gender, identity, and things like that is private. You can talk about it if you want to, but you have the right to abstain from talking about yourself on that level. The right to sexual equity. So this would be, men and women being able, for instance, both being able to vote. But things beyond that would be that there's sexual equity for, depending on your gender, male, female, non-binary, things like that, and everyone having equal rights as far as that goes. The right to sexual pleasure. This kind of goes with privacy, that you can pleasure yourself, or you don't have to necessarily, every time you engage in sexuality, depending on who you are, have sex to procreate. So this is the right to sexual pleasure. So your book takes this stance that sex is not just for procreation. It's obviously much more than that. It is that, but it's also much more than that. The right to emotional sexual expression. So this one I really like. I think that a lot of couples, at least in the U.S. in certain areas, may be able to, so if you have the very stereotypical like man-woman sort of thing, I think that you can see them more prevalently in our society show affection to each other and things like this. And so this right to emotional sexual expression goes for not just your man and woman in a relationship. It can be, if you want to have more than two people in your romantic relationship, or if it's same sex, or depending on if there's someone who identifies as non-binary in their gender, that everyone has the right to their own sexual expression just as much as anyone else. So I think that we see maybe less affection in public and things like that with your non-heteronormative sort of couple. So what your book is saying is that everyone has the right to, be affectionate in public if they want to. This is kind of the same thing, right to sexually associate freely. And then right to make free and responsible reproductive choices. So this is kind of like a separation of church and state sort of thing. So maybe, the Roman Catholic Church says that you cannot abort babies, and also, and so what this sexual right is saying is that everyone has the right to use contraceptives if they want to, and things of that nature. And right to sexual information based on scientific inquiry. So that's going to be a lot of our material in this class will be scientific information about sexuality. So like we talked about, Queen Victoria said, masturbation causes blindness, and she wanted people to not be masturbating and things like that. And it's like, well, let's apply science to these sort of claims. And so that is where we are with what you could say is like the culture of our book and our class. Same thing kind of right here. Number 10, the right to comprehensive sexuality in their education. So that's this class right here, hopefully. In high school as well, public schools, people have the right to their own to a sexual education. That's not necessarily just abstinence based, and and right to sexual health care. So things like contraceptives and things like that, access to it. And this is another piece right here that is the next couple slides that's just more introduction, more dipping our toes into the pool, and before we get to, straight up content sort of things. So your book talks about this concept of sexual intelligence, and I like this for the most part, this concept. So one of the 4 components of being sexually intelligent is really understanding yourself. Now remember, we have the right to sexual privacy. So this isn't about necessarily, communicating this to other people. It's just understanding yourself. So this is what your reflection questions are meant for, and then I'll have extra activities for us to do to help deepen our understanding of ourselves sexually throughout the course. And so this would be things like, who are you attracted to? And, how do you understand your gender? And things like that. Having interpersonal sexual skills and integrity. So this is learning a bit more about how to approach romantic relationships and navigating that sort of thing, sexual relationships, and doing that in a non-coercive manner. Obtaining accurate scientific knowledge. Obviously that would be a part of sexual intelligence, actually learning things about sex. So like we're going to talk about Masters and Johnson's seminal research on the physiological response to sex. And so this would be, accurate scientific knowledge about the very basics of sexuality. And having consideration of the cultural context of sexual intelligence. So, each culture, in a way, is kind of different from each other in what they what they approve of and disapprove of sexually. So it's just good to know which culture you're talking about. In this class, we're going to focus largely on United States culture, but even within the United States, of course, there's great diversity culturally, ethnically, and things like that. So being up and up on the differences between cultures, while understanding at the same time that all of our different cultures may actually be similar too, in their values, sexual values. And we're going to use a psychosocial orientation throughout the semester. So we're going to keep in mind the biological, physiological type stuff, along with the psychological and the social. Sex is obviously very social in nature by and large, and then there's psychological components to that and the biological. So we're kind of trying to hold all three together throughout the semester. As far as psychological factors, I don't think I need to go into too much detail because we kind of went over this in the first presentation. The psychological factors, social, biological, I think we understand that. Okay, so controversy and diversity in human sexuality. I'm not sure if there is a more controversial topic than things as far as sexuality goes. And so even within our own class, a lot of us may be coming from different perspectives or experience levels and things like that. Some of us may have grown up in very restrictive households and things like that, and some of us may have grown up in less restrictive households. So even taking a course on human sexuality that's more frank and scientifically based and things like that may be a huge step for some people as far as learning more about sexuality. A lot of us were maybe raised in cultures that were very sheltered and didn't value the education of sexuality, maybe in fear that the person would exercise that in ways that the people in power didn't want, like parents and whatnot. So our whole course is kind of a little controversial in that. Just kind of check your emotional reactions when I talk about things like anal sex, oral sex, and things like that. You're like, whoa, this is a college course in like a public sort of atmosphere, but we're talking about these very intimate sort of things. I know that can really make your emotions go a little bit and things like that, or it could even excite you and whatnot. It's like, oh, we're finally talking in a professional or a public type context about these sort of things. And so where diversity comes into that is that people have all their different experience levels and whatnot, and everyone has their different reactions, emotional reactions to the content and whatnot, to the course. So this is, in the United States, a lot of people have different perspectives, like we're saying, on sexuality, and even within our class, we're going to see this as well. So we all have maybe from different ethnic groups, different religious groups. Most everyone obviously is the same educational level here, but as far as understanding sexual attitudes, educational level in general is pretty telling as far as permissiveness. Usually the more education that people have, usually the research shows that they become more permissive about sexuality, and the less education people have by and large in the United States, the more restrictive they are about sexuality. Socioeconomic status, that kind of plays together with the education level kind of in a similar way. Differences within group and between groups, we just talked about that in the last slide. And of course similarities as well. So just remember this when you're answering your discussion questions. Just remember, we're all coming from different perspectives. So when you read everyone else's response in the discussion section, just kind of, be aware of that fact that many of us come from different backgrounds. Yeah, and just, yeah, I think that's fine. Okay. So either right now, if you have access to someone you trust to talk about sexuality, you can break and do that. Or you can do this sometime after class. It's just a suggested activity, but I think it could be really eye-opening for some people, especially if they don't usually talk about sexuality. Like I said, suggested activity, you don't have to do it. But you can talk to people about, what messages have you received from your culture, your parents, and things like that about sexuality and gender. And, a good person to talk to if you have a good relationship with them, it would be your parents to talk about these sort of things, especially if you've never talked about it before. May give you a better sense of, why is it that I came to believe what I do about sexuality and things like that. What does sexuality have to do with romantic love? Just to see what people have to say about this. I know a lot of students, regularly engage with other students and people they know talking about these sort of issues, which is great. So continue to do that. And if you don't, but you want to, feel free to talk to people about these sort of things. Okay, so we're going to talk more about the United States and the idea that sex is just for procreation, like a lot of people believed for a while, and some people believe now, and rigid gender roles, which kind of goes hand in hand. So, if you just look at the general consensus of most Americans throughout time, especially if we're looking at like the 1950s and things like that, but even up until now, by and large, but a little bit more in the past, like I said, the 50s, that procreation is the only legitimate reason for sex. And that kind of goes all the way back to when we talked about the different Catholic theologians who really started this idea in a lot of ways, that sex is just meant to be between a man and a woman who are married, and is for procreation only. So this is kind of where we get the idea that some people got the idea that same-sex behavior is bad because they're not procreating. Also, things like masturbation and things like that. I'm sure you've heard, maybe not from your parents or culture or and whatnot, but you may have, encountered these sort of beliefs from other people, obviously. So yeah, it's still a lot of people hold this today. And, men make money, do physical labor, blah, 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 and women have children and take care of the household and whatnot. And it's almost like this moralistic sort of thing that's put onto society that every man and every woman should, if they're going to have sex, get married and only have sex for procreation. Middle East and China have become more restrictive. So in the U.S., we've become a little less restrictive, obviously, having gay marriage now and things like that. But the Middle East and China have become a little more restrictive, while we've become a bit more flexible and open as far as sexuality. And so we talked about the Roman Catholic doctrine. I really encourage you to surf the internet a little bit and look up different things about Roman Catholic theology as far as the body and sex and things like that, just to get a perspective on, how, where did a lot of this influence about sex being for procreation and the rigid gender roles, like where did this come from in our society? And it's not a far cry in our imagination to wonder, did this come in large part from these Catholic theologians and other people and cultures as well? And there's extensive theology, so all of these reasonings based on theological doctrine of why they came to these conclusions about men and women and sex for procreation. But it's good to remember at the same time that not all Catholic people necessarily adhere to this. There's quite a bit of differences among Catholics of who thinks that they can use contraception, or that same-sex marriage is okay, and things like that. There's diversity even within the Catholic tradition there. And just to kind of think about what sort of data or facts are we looking at here, thinking, a lot of people may believe this, but it didn't have any real bearing on our society necessarily, like I'm free to do what I want sort of thing. But you can see the manifestation of this sex being for procreation in the rigid gender roles when you look at our laws that were in place. So literally until 2003, think about that, that's pretty recently, oral and anal sex were illegal in 10 of our states in the United States. And so this law clearly comes from trying to make people only have sex mostly, a penile vaginal intercourse, right, and that would be the only way. So that was the United States way of restricting sexuality. But in 2003, which, like I said, is pretty recent, it's now legal to have oral and anal sex. So this was pretty interesting too. This, I'm not sure of y'all's ages. I assume most of y'all are around 19 or so you may not have much context for President Clinton, Bill Clinton. I don't know, some of you are probably, older than I am, so then you would have context on this. But there was a big scandal with this woman and Bill Clinton on and his having sex with Monica Lewinsky. But for a while there, he was telling the American public, no, I did not have sex. I did not have sex with that woman, is what he said over and over again. And of course, he was just trying to get away with the sexual encounters that he had with Monica Lewinsky. And he kind of came to light that he was like, well, we had oral sex, but we didn't have actual sex. And so you can see in our culture just how everyone emphasizes so much and kind of fixates on penile vaginal intercourse being the end-all be-all and the only legitimate way of having sex. 80% of college students in this study say that oral sex and they don't consider oral sex to be sex. And so I think that's an interesting discussion to say, what does constitute sex? What does that mean, having sex? Is that only penile vaginal intercourse? And I would say that it's not. And it's very healthy to for people who want to express themselves sexually other than penile vaginal intercourse to do in other ways. Yeah. And so there may be this belief that, men are certain ways physically stronger, so that's why they work on the car and push the lawnmower and those sort of things, and then they develop these psychological characteristics of resilience and strength and things like that. And then women develop qualities more like love and care for raising children and things like that. So our physiological difference, being able to bear children, and then having a little bit more physical strength for men, creating those differences between men and women. But a lot, as you can imagine, many women obviously are very strong. And many men are very loving and caring and whatnot. So there is no reason to really think that all women should be one way and all men should be another way. And this isn't even considering people who don't, their gender identity is not male or female, someone who's non-binary and whatnot. A lot of research has come out, and then this would be a good avenue to go down as far as your research goes for the research paper, Rigid Gender Roles Being Harmful to People. So society saying you must be this way oftentimes is very bad on the effect for people, so things like depression and whatnot. Okay, we're going to look at a study here. Truth and Consequences by Alexander and Fisher in 2003 in the Journal of Sex Research. This is a good journal that you may want to type into PsycInfo and see some of the articles that are in there, especially ones that have just come out recently, and that can be a good way also for your research paper of an avenue to go down. So in this study they wanted to see, they hypothesized that there would be a difference between men and women in the frequency of which they report themselves having sexual intercourse, depending on the independent variable would be depending on whether other people know how many people they had sex with. So the more privacy they have, or anonymity, the more, as far as women, would report more sexual partners, which was true in this study. But the less privacy there became, so the least private group of people in the study had a polygraph test, so really kind of invasive in asking these sort of questions. So let's look at men for a second. The men, even if it was very private, they reported the same amount of partners, sexual partners, as compared to the least private with the polygraph test. Men said the same amount. Let's say they all said 3, depending on which situation it was, depending on privacy. Didn't matter for men. But for women, for women, the less privacy they had, the less less partners they said. So in the very private section, they may have said 3, and then the less private it became, the less they said that they number of people they had intercourse with. So Alexander and Fisher kind of theorized from this data that women, there are still more restrictive attitudes and kind of judgments towards women as far as their level of sexual interest and experience and things like that. Kind of in our culture still saying women should be very judicious about their sexual behavior, and men are kind of free to do whatever they want. So this is an interesting study if you want to just look it up and read about it. We have another study here. Damned if you do, damned if you don't, if you're a girl. So this was an interesting study. That's in your book. It was qualitative in nature, meaning it wasn't like questionnaires where they had a Likert type scale saying, 1, 2, 3, 4 answers like that. It wasn't data in that way. It was more interview based, and they came to the conclusion during these interviews of girls, well, first that boys would pressure girls into sending sexual photos, but girls didn't really pressure boys to do that too much. And then also a lot of these participants in the research were saying, girls shouldn't be texting that sort of thing to anyone. So this is double bind for the teenage girls. They're like a lot of pressure saying you shouldn't do this, but then pressure in the other way saying that you should send sexual photos and things like that. But as far as the girls sending sexual texts and whatnot, often called derogatory language and whatnot. But if the boys sent things, then less pressure on them as far as restrictions and whatnot. And this was in 2014. And so this kind of is that previous study kind of goes along with slut shaming. I should have had quotes around that, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Shaming women who like to have sex, calling like derogatory language like this and whatnot. So those two references I have, Flores and Young, are a couple people who have studied that sort of thing. But they but it's been found in research that countries with greater gender equity, normally some of the Nordic countries are said to be better for gender equality, like Norway and Denmark and things like that. And typically their sexual attitudes towards women and men are more equal, saying that, yeah, of course women have sexual desire, of course many women have had sex with multiple people or whatever, and men do too. I mean, and then that's where it stops, as opposed to kind of what we were looking at before, that women have more restrictions and men have less restrictions. So now we'll get into more sexual attitudes and views based on geographical region and culture, ethnicity, and time period. So, the Greeks and Romans. I'm not sure if you've heard too much about Greco-Roman culture and whatnot, but they were a little bit more permissive overall than other cultures that we've talked about before. They talked about how that sex was okay, and we've seen a lot of that people within cultures that say, within marriage, man and woman can have sex, and that's okay. But for the Greeks and Romans around this time, 800 BCE to 200 BCE, saying, you don't need to be married to have sex. Sex is okay outside marriage, and sex is okay between same-sex couples. So this is a little different than some of the cultures that we've talked about before. If you're interested in this on kind of like a philosophical level, look up hedonistic philosophers like Epicurus and things like that, to learn more about what were the actual stances in these cultures of justifications, philosophical justifications for these sort of things. So sexual pleasure being a good thing to pursue. But Plato was a little different from the culture that he was in, saying that sex is kind of distracting from living a virtuous life. So that's interesting. Okay, so we're switching from Greeks and Romans from around 800 to 200 BCE, and now we're talking about the Islamic Middle East. So this is after Prophet Muhammad came, and if you, of course, most of you know that Muslims adhere to the teachings of Muhammad. So, what did Muhammad espouse? What did he write about as far as sexuality? And this was a little bit different also than some of the cultures that we've talked about before. So he said, sex should be enjoyed by both sexes. So like we saw in the Victorian era, they're like, no, women barely even have much of a sexuality at all. Within the Islamic tradition, they're saying, no, sex should be enjoyed by men and women. Sexual desire is there in women and men. And pleasure and things like that. And so you may see within this culture some oppression of women, but your book explains that within the Muslim Islamic tradition, religiously, there's not supposed to be this oppression of women. They should both have freedom as far as this goes. So looking at the actual Quran, the holy book that was written by the Prophet Muhammad, the oppression of women is not, it's not said that that is okay. Prophet Muhammad said that men should be slow and delaying, suggesting that the men should be sensitive to the women's sexual experience. So taking care to, pleasure them as well as experiencing pleasure themselves, the men. And then, of course, depending on, there's a great majority of the world is Muslim, so there are many, many people who are Muslim, so there's a great variation in stances as far as sexual restrictions and gender roles and things like that in the same group of Muslims. So let's switch to a little farther east and talk about Asia. We'll talk a little bit about India and Tibet and China at varying time periods, and how their attitudes towards sexuality. So, ancient China, long time ago, so around 2500 BCE, so we're talking ancient China. Some of the earliest known sex manuals came out of this time, and when Taoism was popular or influential during this time in China, saying that sexuality was good for spiritual growth and harmony. So this is kind of one of the first ones, at least that we're talking about in this class, that it's like sexuality can be for spiritual growth. So this is definitely a different idea to think about. And harmony. So in Taoism, there is a lot of talk in other Eastern religions of yin and yang. So kind of part of the theory here is that the yang energy, the more creative and assertive, confident sort of type masculine energy, coalesces with the yin, or the more feminine, receptive and loving type energy, and coming together to bring more harmony. So men have more peace and women have more strength, sort of thing is what we're looking at here. And still several thousand years ago, looking at Hinduism, which was mostly in India, and Buddhism that came out of India. So Buddhism emerged in the 6th century BCE, and both spread throughout Asia around 500 BCE. And according to your book, both embraced mutual sexual satisfaction between men and women. And so I think that a lot of people, I'm sure you've come across the Kama Sutra, at least have heard about it, and most people believe it's a sex manual that came out of India a long time ago, but it's more than that. I suggest if you're interested in this to, from the library or Amazon or whatever, look up, get the Kama Sutra and see what it's all about and everything. A lot of it is about how to be in a relationship with another person, how to be romantic, how to woo another person, and just living a virtuous life. So it's much more comprehensive than just physically how to have sex. So we're going to talk about tantric sex. You may have heard it called tantric sex, tantra. It'd be interesting to know. Let me know on the ungraded discussion board on Canvas. Just shoot a quick thing to everyone. Say, yeah, I've heard of tantric sex before, or no, I haven't heard of it at all, sort of thing, so I get a better idea of where you guys are at as far as understanding what this is. So before we talk about tantric sex, to understand that, which came out of India and went to Tibet and a lot of these Asian type countries, we'll focus on just understanding at least the Buddhist side of Tantra. So as far as Buddhism goes, there's three main schools. You don't have to remember this for our class, but I'm just telling you this to help you understand what Tantra is before we get into what tantric sex is. So within Buddhism, there's three paths. The Theravada, or Hinayana path, that's much more focused on individual enlightenment and meditation and things like that, self-realization and whatnot. And then the Mahayana tradition is much more about helping not just yourself to attain enlightenment, but also to help other people in the world to attain enlightenment, reduce suffering, and things like that. And then in the third path you have is the Vajrayana, or the diamond vehicle path. And this is much more of a, let's incorporate everything into our spiritual path. So a lot of people in Hinayana and the Mahayana path would be a bit more careful about things such as sexuality, like you would see a lot of Buddhist monks, like within the Hinayana tradition, who say, it's best to be celibate in order to achieve nirvana or enlightenment. But this Vajrayana path is much more about including the physical world and the physical sensations. You hear about the Hinayana path in Buddhism being much more ascetic, much more about simplifying things and calming the mind and things like that, whereas the Vajrayana path is much more, is supposed to be much more powerful or quicker way to attain enlightenment. What's enlightenment? Enlightenment is a very deep, rich topic. Many books written on this topic and whatnot, so I'm not able to really convey exactly what enlightenment is, but is basically this reduction in suffering a lot, so a lot more being emotionally at peace. We have this term that we use in our culture, like nirvana. So this kind of like this mental state that's much more at peace and whatnot. And so what the tantric tradition is saying is that we would be able to achieve this high level of realization and whatnot quicker by including things like sexuality, sensation, perception of things, rather than kind of like the Hinayana path I was talking about is kind of a sequestered, get away from society to do this sort of thing and get away from the normal sort of cultural life, like having a person you're married to and whatnot. And the Vajrayana is much more about incorporating this normal sort of life into one's spiritual path and sexuality. So tantric sex traditionally is for spiritual enlightenment. And it's a religious practice. So there are very specific teachings that a lot of teachers teach to their students who are tantric sex practitioners. And a lot of it's kind of hard to really wrap our minds around unless we're actually part of one of these groups, wrap our minds around what is being taught in these contexts. A lot of times the teachings are secret. So it's really only the people who have committed themselves to a particular teacher or guru before they are initiated into that and taught these practices and whatnot. And so that goes back to the idea of this being a very powerful and quick way to enlightenment, but also at the same time is kind of dangerous in that it may make you veer from a spiritual sort of path at the same time. So this idea that you need someone who has gone through this before, this progression, and can help you along the way, sort of thing, so that these very powerful teachings are okay for you to handle and whatnot. So this is kind of tantric sex in the traditional Eastern sense. And so, as you can imagine, once the West came upon these different teachings, they're like, wow, so much of our religions and our culture have said, kind of the opposite, that sexuality is very dangerous, and if anything, it takes us farther away from spirituality and whatnot, and like in a lot of the Christian traditions that we've talked about in the course. And so a lot of people, once they in the West came upon these teachings, they kind of went with it in their own way. So there are some similarities to New Age, westernized, modern tantric sex. There are some similarities to this, more religious and traditional Eastern approach to tantric sex. In a way, we know a lot more about New Age tantric sex because it's not secret. So people write a lot of books on this, and there are, I think, workshops and all sorts of stuff like that, especially in California and whatnot. And so, in a large way, so this is kind of how it deviates from traditional tantric sex, is that in the New Age sort of view, a lot of writers talk about how it's for the betterment of the romantic relationship. So you incorporate the spirituality into it, taking a lot of reverence for interacting with each other and sexually, and using that spirituality to help the emotional connection you have to your partner. And so my master's thesis was on developing a measure, like a questionnaire, a scale on how can we assess your average person on whether they're having sex in a New Age tantric manner, or are they having sex that would not be described in that way. So I read a lot of books on tantric sex and New Age tantric sex to get an idea of what are the components of tantric sex. And so and I'll go more into exactly what I did in the next chapter when we talk about research methods in sexuality. But for now, I'll tell you about the hypotheses that I had. So I hypothesized from readings, like philosophical readings, that tantric sex, New Age tantric sex, would include mindfulness. But this also goes for traditional religious tantric sex as well. Some information, has leaked out on what it's about, or at least how to do it. And one major thing that comes out of that is this mindfulness. So mindfulness in the context of sexuality is all about being present for the sensations and perceptions that you're having during your sexual encounter, either with yourself or with someone else, or a group of people, and being very mindful of that. So you're not thinking much about the future, even in terms of the near future. Like a lot of times people have sex anticipating the orgasm, and all of the sexual encounter really has to do with achieving that high state of ecstasy. And really the whole time you're doing foreplay and having sex and whatnot, you're thinking about the future. You're thinking about that orgasm. So mindfulness is incorporated into tantric sex, New Age tantric sex, and religious tantric sex, in that they're just focusing on the feelings that they're having with another person. Sensations, feelings, emotions, thoughts in that very present moment, and using the energy, sexual energy, to kind of energize the whole body and mind. And so spiritual purpose, I found that was in there too. So in a way, this mindfulness and the spiritual purpose, at least I hypothesized, would be part of tantric sex. The spiritual purpose is that in there as well for New Age type tantric sex. So that attainment of high states of realization. And then there are a lot of different tantric techniques specifically. So they talk a lot about synchronized breathing. So like your partner breathes out, you breathe in, you breathe out, your partner breathes in. So it's all about this connectivity and whatnot. And as far as orgasms go, this is a big topic in tantric sex, at least New Age tantric sex. Kind of like what I was saying before with mindfulness, saying, a lot of times people have sex really anticipating the orgasm. It's all about the orgasm. But for tantric sex, it's like, well, orgasm may not even be on the table. Really, having orgasm is just going to get you away from having these really almost altered states of consciousness through sexuality. So experiencing the orgasm, basically, at least for many men, would result in not having sex anymore. So tantric sex, you hear a lot about that sex can go on for a long time, because you're trying to sustain that high energy in the encounter. So mindfulness, spiritual purpose, and specific physical tantric techniques like synchronized breathing and de-emphasizing the importance of orgasm are all things that, through my readings that I did, found that those were the qualities of New Age tantric sex. So I'll tell you about some books and things like that I would suggest to learn more about this. And if you will, listen to this first YouTube video. Really the most important part is, as you see, from minute 30 or second 35 until 1:05, and she talks a lot about how in tantric sex there's a lot of reverence for the other person, and so there's this idea in tantra that the physical is sacred. So this is definitely a different idea than what we've heard about before with some of the Catholic theologians. So the physical is divine, sacred, and so when you're engaging in sexuality, there is this almost religious, spiritual sort of element to the sexual encounter. And then the second video you can listen from, and then that first video, of course, feel free to listen to the whole thing, but I feel like the most pertinent information is what I listed, and kind of the same thing for this next guy who talks about it, and I feel like that is worth your time as well. You could watch the whole thing if you wanted, but especially from the very beginning to minute 125 would be what I want you to listen to. And then we will talk more about tantric sex later in the course. Alright, so let's talk about more modern China. So they had in around the 50s, early 40s, had a big push from the government to be more sexually conservative. And so this came out in things kind of like the Victorian era, like basic information about sexuality just not being there. So things like sex education in school not being much of a thing, and things like that. So you can see that the government is just, they're hoping that if they just make everyone not talk about sexuality, then people won't really do it. Sex outside marriage, discouraged. Even frequent sex within marriage, discouraged. So this is kind of similar to, a little similar to Catholic doctrine, saying, sex should just be for procreation. It's kind of the same thing here that the Chinese government espoused. It seemed to work in a way as far as trying to control people's sexualities, because there were almost no sexually transmitted diseases or infections during that time. So that shows kind of how effective the government was at controlling sexual behavior. But currently, it's becoming less restrictive. So a little bit more open to homosexuality than it was during 1949. Also increasing in premarital sex and things like abortion and whatnot. Alright, so let's talk about media. The media and sexuality, not just inherently because we want to know what sexuality is like in the media, but think of this section as like, well, what are the sexual attitudes now? Because they may be reflected in our media, so television and movies and things like that, internet, you know what media is. So we'll talk about television first. So I thought this was an interesting little tidbit from your book. Then 1869 was the first movie that was publicized with with a couple kissing, and it was very controversial at the time. But clearly, we have progressed to more and more explicit sexual behaviors in our television. So studies that have been done on the content, just looking at, all of the television that there is, randomly sampled, seeing, what percent of television shows have some sort of explicit sexual element to it, and they found that 80% of the shows had explicit sexual content. So this is definitely different culturally than we have seen before, as far as kind of endorsing a more open sexual framework. And so you have television shows that represent the LGBT community more and more, we're seeing on television and whatnot. Your book talks about how especially white teenagers in a study seem to consume more than other cultures sexual media. And through that, they also, so the correlational data with that is that they engaged in premarital intercourse, so like around 16 or earlier, engaged in that sooner. So it's hard to tell whether these white teens just wanted to consume, they were just more sexual in general, or if it was the actual media, sexual media, that made them more sexual. It's hard to determine that because it's correlational study, but interesting nonetheless. And some people are worried that there's so much sexual media that may be making very young people have ideas about sexuality that are not fully educated as far as pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections and things like that. Music videos, very explicitly sexual often, and themes that come from a lot of music videos are males being more assertive and women being more submissive. So this is kind of a little bit of a theme that you can see in music videos. And then advertising. A lot of advertising has sexual content in it, as we know, and really kind of communicating to people in our society saying, if you buy our pair of jeans, then you're going to be more attractive and have more sex. Or, hey, look at this woman, don't you think she is attractive? If you wear this cologne or whatever, you'll have a partner like her or something like that. So advertising has definitely leveraged sexual desire and whatnot, and to sell their products. And in a lot of magazines, your book talks about how they often talk about the ideal body that you should have, especially for women, but sometimes for men too. And this can really have a negative effect on how we view our bodies if we always see in magazines or television that we watch that there's this specific body type that's attractive to people. Then that may inadvertently infiltrate our minds and make us think that our bodies are supposed to be a certain way in order to be attractive. So in that way, magazines can be not very helpful as far as that goes, and really making you focus so much on your physical appearance as opposed to the actual connection that you have to this other person that you may be being sexual with. And so the internet, as far as a media goes, obviously pretty much everyone almost in the world has access to internet for the most part. So this is definitely a major avenue of media that people have. It's pretty amazing that people like pornography so much that even if you take into account of all the time that people spend on Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter all combined, people are spending more time watching pornography and using that. And many of us may have views that pornography is is kind of dangerous or not to be engaged in, and then varying other people may believe there's no problem with pornography, or it could depend on what type of pornography that people approve of more than others. And like I said, Dr. Joshua Grubbs is going to come talk to us about pornography because he's an expert in that field as far as pornography and psychology. So I'm looking forward to that. And it's not just pornography that is out there on the internet. There are also adult interactive games and a lot of other ways that people can engage sexually through the computer or their handheld device. And so there's so much more availability of sexual content and anonymity at the same time with the internet and sexuality that many people feel, researchers feel that the internet has quite a bit of potential to impact sexuality, sexual attitudes, sexual behaviors, and things like that. So that's where we'll end today. So this was the second lecture of Chapter 1, so the end of Week 2. I will make sure you know what the discussion question for the week was and what the reflection question of the week was. And yeah, look forward to hearing y'all's feedback about what your thoughts are on the lectures and information that we're talking about and things like that. So thank you.